A Russian missile cruiser cut through the waters of the Pacific, and 26 years into his rule, Vladimir Putin finally set foot on a piece of land he had never dared to visit before. Within hours, Tokyo detonated a diplomatic bomb of its own, and Washington moved with a speed that stunned even seasoned observers of the region. This is the story of how one reckless landing on a disputed island triggered a response so fast and so unified that it may have permanently buried Putin's entire dream of dominating the Pacific. The trigger for this entire crisis was a single, deliberate act of political theater staged by the Kremlin on August the 13th. Vladimir Putin traveled to Iturup, the largest of the 4 islands in the southern Kuril chain, a territory Japan calls the Northern Territories, and has claimed as its own sovereign land for more than 7 decades. This marked the very first time in his more than a quarter century in power that Putin had personally set foot on this contested ground, and the first visit by any Russian president to the islands since Dmitry Medvedev made a similar trip back in 2010. Russian state media broadcast carefully staged footage of Putin touring the Yasny fish plant, sampling local caviar, visiting a hospital, and stopping by a local school, images designed to project an unmistakable message of permanent Russian ownership over land that Tokyo has never stopped claiming as its own. The timing of this visit was anything but accidental. It arrived just days after Japan published its 2026 Defense White Paper, a document outlining Tokyo's rapidly evolving military posture in the region, and analysts at the Washington-based Institute for the Study of War quickly concluded that Putin's landing represented a calculated response specifically designed to undermine Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi at a politically sensitive moment. It also came just one day after Putin delivered a defiant speech from the deck of the missile cruiser Voryag during the final stages of Russia's Pacific Fleet exercises, where he addressed European plans to seize so-called Shadow Fleet oil tankers, dismissing such actions as nothing more than piracy and robbery, and promising what he called a mirror response anywhere, including within the zone of responsibility of Russia's own Pacific Fleet. Japan's response to the island landing arrived within hours, and it left absolutely no room for ambiguity. Prime Minister Takaichi stepped in front of cameras and declared the visit absolutely unacceptable, stating bluntly that the trip wounded the feelings of the Japanese. People stood in direct contradiction to Tokyo's long-standing and consistent position on the islands. Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi moved just as quickly, summoning Russian Ambassador Nikolai Nozdrev to the ministry to deliver a formal and forceful protest directly to his face. Japan's government reiterated once again to the entire world that the islands, including Iturup, as Japan calls Iturup, remain an inseparable part of Japanese territory both historically and under established international law. If you find this kind of deeply researched geopolitical breakdown valuable, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, because the standoff building in the Pacific right now is only getting more intense. To fully grasp why this dispute has remained unresolved for more than 7 decades, it helps to understand the tangled legal history underlying the entire Kuril Islands controversy. The Soviet Union seized the islands from Japan during the final chaotic days of the Second World War, and while Japan formally renounced all right, title, and claim to the broader Kuril chain under the terms of the 1951 Treaty of San Francisco, that same treaty never actually recognized Soviet sovereignty over the 4 southernmost islands specifically. This unresolved legal ambiguity has prevented Tokyo and Moscow from ever formally signing a peace treaty, bringing a definitive end to their wartime hostilities, even though a 1956 joint declaration technically ended the state of war between the 2 nations decades ago. Successive Japanese and Russian leaders have periodically attempted to negotiate their way towards some kind of lasting settlement, including previous discussions between Putin and former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe that explored possibilities ranging from joint business development on the islands to a broader peace treaty framework. Yet none of these diplomatic efforts ultimately produced any visible or lasting breakthrough. His decades-long diplomatic stalemate matters enormously for understanding why Putin's decision to physically set foot on Iturup carried such outsized symbolic weight. Previous Russian leaders had generally approached the islands with at least some degree of rhetorical caution, careful not to completely foreclose the possibility of eventual negotiation with Tokyo. Putin's own historic visit represented a clear and deliberate departure from that pattern, an unmistakable signal that Moscow now views the islands as permanently and non-negotiably Russian territory, full stop. His comments delivered aboard the Voryag just 1 day before the landing reinforced this message directly, with Putin declaring that the current status of the islands remained enshrined in international documents as a reality that emerged directly from the outcome of the Second World War, even while claiming that Russia remained theoretically prepared to seek some eventual solution toward a peace treaty with Japan. The broader regional context surrounding this crisis has also grown considerably more dangerous given the parallel military buildup. unfolding simultaneously involving North Korea. Pyongyang has continued launching intercontinental ballistic missiles at a steady pace throughout this period, deliberately occupying American and Japanese missile defense radar systems and adding what regional security analysts increasingly describe as a genuine third leg to an emerging axis linking Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang in their shared strategic interest in constraining Japan's rise and complicating American military operations throughout the broader Indo-Pacific region. This three-way alignment, however loosely coordinated it may actually be behind the scenes, has significantly complicated Tokyo's own defense planning, forcing Japanese military leadership to simultaneously prepare for potential threats emerging from three separate and geographically distinct directions at once. Japan's response to this expanding threat environment has extended well beyond its own borders as well, reflecting a broader diplomatic transformation that mirrors the country's parallel military buildup. Tokyo has signed reciprocal access agreements with both the Philippines and Australia, granting Japanese forces the historic ability to deploy on friendly foreign territory for the first time since the Second World War. This expanding network of defense partnerships, combined with joint combat aircraft development alongside the United Kingdom and Italy, illustrates just how thoroughly Japan has abandoned its traditional post-war posture of strict military restraint in favor of a much more assertive and internationally engaged defense strategy. Public opinion within Japan itself has also shifted dramatically in response to Putin's provocative visit, with the Kuril Islands controversy reportedly hardening anti-Russian sentiment among ordinary Japanese citizens in ways that will likely prove difficult for any future government to walk back. Tokyo now officially characterizes Russia's continued control over the islands since 2022 as an illegal occupation, a marked rhetorical escalation compared to the more cautious diplomatic language Japanese officials had traditionally used when discussing the dispute in previous decades. This hardening public sentiment gives Prime Minister Takaichi considerably more domestic political room to pursue an assertive response to Russian provocations than any of her predecessors would likely have enjoyed, even as some commentators within Japan have cautioned that overly aggressive rhetoric risks simultaneously straining relations with China over the separate and equally sensitive question of Taiwan. Analysts, tracking the broader strategic calculus at play, have offered a range of assessments regarding just how seriously Moscow's threatening rhetoric should actually be taken. Some have pointed to Medvedev's warning of terrible consequences as evidence that Russia could potentially respond to any further Japanese escalation by forward deploying tactical nuclear weapons directly to the Kuril Islands themselves, a move explicitly designed to remove any ambiguity regarding the potential costs of what Moscow would characterize as military adventurism on Tokyo's part. Others have suggested that Russia's own severely constrained military resources, stretched thin by the ongoing war in Ukraine, make any such dramatic escalation considerably less likely in practice than the Kremlin's rhetoric alone might suggest, framing Putin's Pacific provocations as primarily a calculated bluff intended to slow Japan's military transformation rather than a genuine prelude to direct confrontation. Regardless of which interpretation ultimately proves correct, the practical reality on the ground throughout the region has already shifted in ways that will likely prove difficult to reverse. The waters around Hokkaido and the disputed northern territories have become one of the most heavily armed and closely watched flashpoints anywhere in the world, with American nuclear submarines reportedly shadowing Russia's Pacific fleet throughout the cold waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, even as Japanese coastal defense batteries remain positioned and ready along the Hokkaido coastline. Every additional Russian provocation in the region appears only to accelerate exactly the kind of rapid Japanese military buildup and deepening Western alliance cohesion that Moscow can least afford given its own severely overstretched military resources throughout the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Moscow's reply carried none of the careful diplomatic language Tokyo had used in its own protest. Russia's embassy in Japan flatly stated that the islands belonged to Moscow and that Putin's travel there was, in their words, not a matter for discussion with foreign states at all. Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, delivered an even more pointed and threatening message, stressing that the Kuril Islands would remain Russian territory forever and warning that anyone who questioned that fact would face what he described as terrible consequences. This kind of blunt, almost nuclear-level rhetoric from one of Putin's closest allies made unmistakably clear that Moscow had no intention of backing down from its position, regardless of how forcefully Tokyo chose to respond. What happened next is exactly why this crisis has come to represent far more than a simple bilateral dispute between Russia and Japan. Washington moved with remarkable speed to formalize its own position, and the response landed with real weight. United States ambassador to Japan, George Glass, took to social media just one day after Putin's landing, stating plainly that America remained unwavering in its support of its most important ally, and in its recognition of Japanese sovereignty over the northern territories. He added a pointed warning of his own, declaring that at a time when the alliance between Washington and Tokyo was dedicated to cultivating prosperity across the entire Indo-Pacific region, the United States strongly opposed any action that undermined the peace and stability. Describing Japan as America's most important ally represented an unmistakable elevation in language, underscoring just how seriously Washington now views this alliance amid rising and increasingly dangerous competition with both Russia and China throughout the broader region. To understand why the single island landing carries such enormous strategic weight, it helps to look at exactly what these islands actually represent to Moscow's broader military posture in the Pacific. The Kuril chain does far more than simply mark a contested border. These islands transform the Sea of Okhotsk into a protected and secure bastion for Russia's ballistic missile submarines, providing exactly the kind of sheltered operating environment that Russia's entire nuclear deterrent in the Pacific ultimately depends upon. If these islands were ever to fall under any form of Japanese or Allied control, the United States Navy would gain a dramatically improved ability to penetrate directly toward the heart of Russia's nuclear submarine bastion and actively hunt those vessels in waters Moscow currently treats as essentially untouchable. This explains why Russia has steadily militarized the islands over the years, integrating Bastion and Balcoastal defense missile systems alongside S-300 V-4 air defense batteries, specifically to turn this remote island chain into what amounts to an unsinkable aircraft carrier, guarding the approaches to its most sensitive naval assets. Russia's calculated provocation in the Pacific did not emerge in isolation from its broader relationship with Beijing either. Earlier in the summer, Russian and Chinese warships conducted a joint patrol lasting more than 2 weeks throughout East Asian waters, accompanied overhead by Chinese H-6K and Russian Tu-90 FEBMES strategic bombers that deliberately locked their radar systems onto Japanese air defense installations, a calculated escalation clearly designed to test and probe Tokyo's response capabilities. Japan's military detected this formation, approaching directly toward the southern borders of Hokkaido in late July. And when the exercise finally concluded in Vladivostok, few analysts doubted that further escalation would soon follow. Putin's own arrival aboard, the Varyag for the culmination of Russia's Pacific Fleet exercises, followed almost immediately by his historic landing on Iturup, represented the next deliberate step in exactly this pattern of coordinated pressure against Japan from both Moscow and Beijing simultaneously. This coordinated pressure campaign reflects what regional analysts increasingly describe as a genuine anti-access, area denial strategy jointly pursued by Russia and China, one specifically designed to complicate and constrain the ability of American naval forces to operate freely throughout the region in the event of any future conflict. China has continued applying its own distinct pressure on Japan from the southwest, particularly around Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands, maintaining Type 0555 class stealth-guided missile destroyers on continuous patrol throughout these waters as an unmistakable signal that Beijing retains the capability to threaten Japan's maritime trade routes whenever it chooses. Layered on top of this military pressure, Beijing has simultaneously restricted exports of critical rare earth elements that Japan's defense industry depends on, adding a genuine economic dimension to what is already an intensifying military standoff throughout the broader Indo-Pacific region. Yet this entire Russian and Chinese pressure campaign appears to be badly underestimating just how dramatically Japan itself has transformed in recent years. Tokyo is no longer the passive, purely self-defensive nation it remained throughout most of the post-war era. With the establishment of a unified Joint Operations Command in 2025, bringing all three branches of Japan's military under a single coordinated structure, the country's self-defense forces have evolved into a genuinely capable fighting organization, able to make rapid offensive decisions when required. Japan's defense budget has climbed to a record level in 2026, and Tokyo has formally rewritten its national defense strategy to explicitly include the capability to strike enemy targets directly on their own territory, a fundamental shift away from Japan's traditional reliance on purely defensive military doctrine throughout the decades following the Second World War. The sharpest expression of this new offensive capability comes in the form of the roughly 400 Tomahawk cruise missiles Japan has purchased directly from the United States. In July of 2026, the Japanese Aegis destroyer JS Chokai successfully completed the first live fire test of these missiles in Pacific waters, demonstrating a weapon system with a range of 1,600 kilometers capable of striking Russian bases in the Far East or Chinese coastal targets with real precision. These same missiles are now being integrated into the vertical launch systems of Japan's newest submarine fleet, creating an increasingly difficult to detect strike capability that fundamentally alters the military calculus facing both Moscow and Beijing throughout the broader region. Japan's military modernization extends well beyond simply purchasing American weapon systems as well. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries has poured enormous research and development resources into developing indigenous hypersonic cruise missile technology, while the country's shipbuilders have accelerated production of Mogami-class multi-mission stealth frigates specifically designed to minimize radar signature and maximize asymmetric warfare capability throughout contested Pacific waters. Tokyo has also extended the range of its domestically produced Type 12 coastal defense missiles to a full 1,000 kilometers, deploying these systems along the Hokkaido coastline at strategically critical positions, specifically intended to make any Russian amphibious operation against the region an almost unthinkable proposition. In the skies above the Pacific, Japan's technological edge continues expanding with each passing year. The Global Combat Air Program, developed jointly alongside the United Kingdom and Italy, is progressing toward the deployment of genuinely sixth generation stealth aircraft that would establish clear technological superiority over both Russia's Su-57 and China's J-20 fighter platforms throughout the region. Chaito's air base in Hokkaido maintains combat jets on continuous, round-the-clock alerts specifically against Russian aircraft, and throughout 2025 alone, Japanese F-15 and F-35 fighters scrambled on hundreds of separate occasions. In direct response to Russian border violations, aircraft now equipped with upgraded guided munitions capable of far more than simple interception missions. Japan has also developed an increasingly sophisticated autonomous defense network built around thousands of coordinated air, surface, and underwater drones, a system designed specifically to detect and neutralize any approaching enemy fleet well before it ever reaches Japanese coastal waters. This network relies heavily on MQ-9B Sea Guardian unmanned aircraft, continuously monitoring Pacific shipping lanes and relaying real-time positional data on enemy vessels directly back to Japan's own Aegis-equipped destroyer fleet, creating exactly the kind of layered, technologically advanced defensive shield that Russia's aging Pacific fleet increasingly struggles to operate against without significant risk. This dramatic and rapidly accelerating Japanese military buildup helps explain precisely why Putin appears to have grown so aggressive regarding the Kuril Islands at this particular moment. Russia's own Pacific fleet has suffered genuine logistical and personnel strain throughout the ongoing war in Ukraine, with resources and manpower repeatedly diverted toward the Western Front at the direct expense of the country's broader military posture throughout the Far East. Analysts increasingly view Putin's provocative visit as an attempt to slow and disrupt Japan's rapid military transformation before Tokyo's newest and most dangerous capabilities become fully operational, applying pressure now specifically because Moscow understands its own relative position in the region will likely only continue weakening as time goes on. But this calculated Russian gamble may end up costing Moscow far more than Putin ever anticipated. Rather than intimidating Tokyo into backing down, Japan has instead raised its own military alert status to the highest level, while the broader alliance structure surrounding the country continues strengthening in direct response to exactly this kind of provocation. The trilateral partnership between the United States, Japan, and South Korea, cemented through the Camp David Summit framework, has already activated an integrated radar sharing system capable of detecting and responding to missile launches from either China or North Korea within a matter of seconds. Simultaneously, the broader Quad Alliance, which includes India and Australia as founding partners alongside the United States and Japan, continues weaving what increasingly resembles a genuine maritime wall throughout the Indo-Pacific, deliberately narrowing the operational space available to both Russian and Chinese naval forces throughout the region. American military power in Japan itself remains formidable by any measure, anchored by roughly 55,000 Americans, troops representing the largest forward-deployed United States military presence anywhere in the world. The Navy's 7th Fleet, headquartered at Yokosuka, maintains an aircraft carrier strike group capable of responding within seconds to any coordinated action by Russia or China, supported by Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines patrolling the strategically vital First Island, chained throughout the region. Kadena Air Base in Okinawa stands ready with American F-35 and F-15 fighters capable of scrambling immediately to defend Japanese airspace, while newly deployed Typhoon mid-range missile systems undergoing testing at bases throughout Japan represent exactly the kind of emerging capability that continues shifting the broader balance of power throughout the Asia-Pacific decisively in favor of Washington and its allies. As this crisis continues to unfold, the strategic picture emerging from Putin's brief visit to a fish processing plant on a remote Pacific island grows clearer with each passing day. Rather than successfully demonstrating Russian strength or intimidating Tokyo into any kind of meaningful concession, Putin's calculated provocation appears instead to have accelerated exactly the kind of unified Western response and rapid Japanese military transformation that Moscow can least afford to face, given its already overstretched military resources throughout Ukraine. Whether this single reckless landing on a disputed island ultimately triggers a broader and more dangerous confrontation throughout the Pacific, or simply cements Japan's permanent transformation into a genuine military power capable of standing firmly against both Russia and China simultaneously, one outcome already appears unmistakably clear. Putin's dream of quietly dominating the Pacific through intimidation alone has collided directly with a Japan and an American alliance that no longer intends to simply watch from the sidelines,